Sometimes life gives a man one last chance when he least expects it. For Wes Holt, a weathered 58-year-old cowboy whose rodeo dreams had turned to dust, that chance came as a rotting mountain cabin sold for just $5 at a tax auction. With only his loyal dog Scout for company, Wes was looking for nothing more than a quiet place to fade away from the world. But when Scout started scratching at loose floorboards, everything changed. What they found buried beneath decades of neglect wasn't just an old metal box. It was treasure worth over $1 million, along with letters revealing a forgotten love story. Could this discovery give Wes the second chance he never thought he deserved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. The October wind carried the scent of pine needles and distant snow as Wes Holt's battered pickup truck wheezed up the narrow mountain road, its engine protesting every steep turn. In the passenger seat, Scout, a border collie with intelligent amber eyes and graying fur around his muzzle, pressed his nose against the cracked window, his tail giving an occasional hopeful thump against the worn upholstery. Wes kept his weathered hands steady on the steering wheel, though his knuckles showed white beneath skin tanned by decades under harsh suns. 58 years of hard living had carved deep lines around his grey-blue eyes, and his dark hair, now more silver than brown, peeked out from beneath a faded black cowboy hat that had seen better decades. The hatband held a small silver concho, the only jewelry he wore aside from the tarnished championship belt buckle that occasionally caught light from beneath his worn flannel shirt. That buckle told a story Wes tried not to remember. World Champion Bull Rider, 1989, it read, though the words had worn smooth from years of his thumb unconsciously tracing them during moments of regret. It was all that remained of Wesley James Holt's glory days, when crowds cheered his name and sponsors lined up to shake his hand. Back then he'd been somebody. Back then he'd had Marie. "Easy, boy," Wes murmured to Scout as the dog whined softly, sensing his master's dark thoughts. "We're almost there." The cabin appeared around the final bend, like something from a fever dream. Wes pulled the truck to a stop and simply stared. The real estate agent's description of rustic mountain retreat had been generous to the point of outright lies. The structure sagged like an old man's back, its roof missing shingles in several places, and the front porch tilting at an alarming angle. Weathered grey siding had pulled away from the frame in spots, and the stone chimney leaned precariously, held upright more by stubborn hope than structural integrity. "Well, Scout," Wes said, his voice carrying the dry humor that had sustained him through 2 decades of disappointment. "I reckon we've found our palace." Scout barked once, a sharp, optimistic sound, and scratched at the door handle. Wes chuckled despite himself. The dog's enthusiasm had carried them through some dark times. When the bottle had nearly claimed him in '98, Scout had been there. When Marie finally gave up and left him that cold February morning in 2001, Scout had stayed. When the last of his prize money ran out and creditors started circling like vultures, Scout never judged. Wes climbed out of the truck, his left knee protesting with the familiar ache that came from one too many 8-second rides that had ended badly. Scout bounded out after him, immediately beginning an investigation of their new surroundings with the thoroughness of a detective. The dog's nose worked constantly, processing scents and stories Wes could only imagine. The afternoon sun filtered through tall pines, casting long shadows across what might once have been a maintained yard. Now it was a tangle of wild grass, fallen branches, and the skeletal remains of what looked like a vegetable garden. A rusty water pump stood near the cabin's side wall, its handle frozen with age and neglect. Wes pulled his duffel bag from the truck bed. Everything he owned fit in that one worn canvas sack and a cardboard box of canned goods. As he approached the cabin, each step on the wooden porch produced an alarming creak. The front door hung slightly ajar, secured only by a new padlock the county had installed after seizing the property for unpaid taxes. The key the auctioneer had given him turned easily. Too easily, Wes thought. Like the lock was eager to give up its secrets, The door swung open with a prolonged groan, and the smell hit him immediately. Decades of dust, mouse droppings, and something else. Something that whispered of long-kept secrets and forgotten sorrows. Scout pushed past him, tail wagging, apparently unbothered by scents that made Wes's skin crawl. The interior was dim, illuminated only by shafts of sunlight that found their way through gaps in the boarded windows. Dust motes danced in the golden beams like tiny spirits. The main room was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and rough-hewn logs forming the others. A narrow staircase led to what Wes assumed was a loft. Though the upper shadows held their mysteries, furniture remained, abandoned when the last owner died or fled. A wooden table scarred by decades of use, two mismatched chairs, a rocking chair that moved slightly in the draught from the open door. On the mantelpiece, a layer of dust, thick as velvet, covered what looked like an old clock and some framed photographs, too grimy to make out clearly. Scout had immediately begun his inspection, nose to the ground, working his way systematically around the room's perimeter. He paused occasionally, ears perked, as if hearing sounds beyond Wes's range. Near the far corner of the room, the dog stopped entirely, whining softly and scratching at the floorboards. "What is it, boy?" Wes asked, but Scout was lost in whatever scent trail had captured his attention. Wes set his duffel on the table, sending up a small cloud of dust that made him sneeze. Through the grime-covered window, he could see his truck looking small and out of place among the towering pines. Beyond that, the mountains stretched away in rolling waves of green and grey, beautiful and harsh in the way that had always called to him. This was where it ended then. After 39 years since his first professional rodeo, after the championships and the whiskey and the woman who'd loved him before he broke her heart with his weakness, this was where Wesley James Holt would make his last stand. A $5 cabin in the middle of nowhere, with only a dog for company and silence for conversation. But as Scout continued his urgent investigation of the floorboards, something about the dog's behavior nagged at Wes. In all their years together, he'd never seen Scout quite like this, focused, almost obsessive, as if he'd found something that demanded immediate attention. The afternoon light was fading, painting the cabin's interior in deeper shades of gold and shadow. Wes found a kerosene lantern on the mantelpiece, surprisingly still containing fuel. With the steady hands of a man who'd spent countless nights in temporary shelters, he lit the wick, and warm light pushed back the gathering darkness. In the improved illumination, he could see more details. The cabin's construction was solid, despite its neglected appearance. Thick logs, chinked with clay and moss, wide plank floors that had once been carefully finished. Someone had built this place to last, had intended it to be a home rather than merely a shelter. Scout's whining grew more insistent. The dog had settled in the corner, front paws working at something between the floorboards. As Wes approached with the lantern, he could see what had captured Scout's attention. One of the wide planks sat slightly higher than its neighbors, as if the nails holding it down had loosened over time. "You find something interesting, partner?" Wes asked, kneeling beside the dog. Scout looked up at him with those amber eyes that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and certainty. The dog barked once, sharp and urgent, then returned his attention to the loose board. Wes set the lantern down and examined the plank more carefully. The wood was dry and weathered, and when he pressed down on one end, the other end lifted slightly, like a lever. It wasn't loose from neglect. It had been deliberately designed this way, a hiding place. For a moment, Wes hesitated. Whatever lay beneath that board had been hidden for a reason, probably for years. Did he have the right to disturb it? Was he ready for whatever secrets this abandoned place might hold? Scout settled the matter by barking again and scratching more vigorously at the wood, as if to say that some discoveries were meant to be made, regardless of the discoverer's doubts. The wind outside had picked up, setting the pines to singing and making the old cabin creak and settle around them. Night was coming to the mountains, bringing with it the kind of cold that seeps into a man's bones and reminds him of his mortality. Wes looked around the cabin one more time, at the accumulated dust of forgotten years, at the photographs on the mantelpiece that held the faces of strangers, at the rocking chair that moved slightly as if pushed by invisible hands. Then he looked down at Scout, whose unwavering attention to the loose floorboard suggested that this moment, this choice, might be more important than it seemed. Outside, an owl called, a lonesome sound that spoke of wild places and ancient secrets. The kerosene lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, and Wes Holt found himself at a crossroads he hadn't expected. Behind him lay 30 years of disappointment and regret. Ahead lay only questions and the promise of another cold night in another temporary shelter. But beneath his feet, if Scout's instincts were right, lay something else entirely, something that might change everything. Wes had intended to ignore Scout's obsession with the floorboard, at least until morning. The long drive up the mountain had exhausted him, and the reality of his $5 purchase was settling in like a lead weight in his chest. He'd spread his sleeping bag on the dusty floor, eaten a cold can of beans by lantern light, and tried to convince himself that tomorrow would bring clarity to this mess he'd made of his life. But Scout had other plans. The dog had positioned himself over the loose plank like a sentry, occasionally whining and pawing at the wood. Even when Wes called him over to share the meager meal, Scout would take only a few bites before returning to his post. The border collie's ears remained pricked forward, his body tense with anticipation, as if he could hear something moving beneath the floor. "Scout, come on," Wes finally said around midnight, patting the sleeping bag. "Whatever's down there has waited this long. It can wait till morning." Scout looked at him with those amber eyes that seemed to hold reproach, then deliberately returned his attention to the floorboard. He began digging at it again, his claws finding purchase in the gap between planks. The sound, scratch, 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 echoed in the quiet cabin like a persistent knock at the door. Wes tried to sleep, but every time he began to drift off, Scout's scratching would pull him back to consciousness. The dog was nothing if not determined. By 2 in the morning, Wes admitted defeat. "All right, you stubborn mutt," he muttered, crawling out of his sleeping bag. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." He relit the kerosene lantern and knelt beside Scout, who immediately began panting with excitement. In the flickering light, Wes could see that the dog's persistent efforts had widened the gap around the loose plank. When he pressed down on one end, the other end lifted nearly an inch, definitely not the result of loose nails. Wes went to his duffel bag and pulled out a folding knife, one of the few things of value he still owned. The blade was sharp and well-maintained, old habits from his military days, before the rodeo, before everything went sideways. He worked the tip of the knife into the gap and applied gentle pressure. The plank lifted easily, revealing a space beneath that was deeper than the normal floor joists would allow. Someone had deliberately carved out a hiding place in the cabin's structure, lining it with what looked like oiled canvas to protect whatever lay within. "Well, I'll be damned," Wes whispered. Scout's tail wagged furiously as Wes lifted the lantern higher, peering into the hidden compartment. At first, he saw only shadows and what looked like more oiled canvas. Then the light caught something metallic, the corner of a box, maybe 8 inches square, made of some kind of dark metal that had resisted the passage of time. Wes reached down carefully, half expecting the box to crumble at his touch. Instead, his fingers found solid, substantial weight, heavy enough to make him grunt with effort as he lifted it from its hiding place. The metal was cool and smooth, with an intricate pattern etched around the lid that might once have been decorative, but was now worn almost smooth. Setting the box on the floor beside Scout, who sniffed it thoroughly before giving an approving tail wag, Wes examined the simple clasp that held it closed. No lock, just a metal latch that had kept its secrets for who knew how many years. His hands trembled slightly as he worked the clasp free, from anticipation or exhaustion. He couldn't say. The lid opened with a soft groan of protest. Inside, nested in faded red velvet, lay treasures that made Wes's breath catch in his throat. Coins, dozens of them arranged in careful rows. Even in the uncertain lantern light, he could see they were old, much older than anything that belonged in a mountain cabin. Gold caught the flickering flame and threw it back in warm gleams. Silver pieces bore dates he had to read twice to believe, but it wasn't just the coins that captured his attention. Beneath them, tied with a ribbon that had once been white but was now yellowed with age, lay a bundle of letters. The handwriting on the topmost envelope was feminine, delicate, written in faded brown ink that spoke of careful penmanship from a more formal time, and beside the letters, folded carefully and protected by another piece of oiled canvas, was what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. The paper was thick and heavy, the kind they didn't make anymore, and the ink lines showed mountains, streams, and landmarks marked with symbols Wes didn't recognize. Scout whined softly and nudged Wes's elbow, as if to say, "I told you so." "Good boy," Wes murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Good boy, Scout. You found us something special." With hands that shook now from more than fatigue, Wes lifted one of the coins from its velvet bed. It was heavy, substantial, with sharp edges that spoke of careful minting. The date read 1887, and the words $20 were etched clearly around what he recognized as a Liberty Head design. $20 in 1887 would have been serious money. This coin alone was worth, well, he didn't know exactly, but enough to make his heart race. He counted quickly, trying not to let hope overwhelm his natural caution. 43 gold coins of various denominations, from $5 pieces to double eagles. Silver dollars, quarters, and half-dollars that looked like they'd never seen circulation. His military training kicked in, the same methodical approach that had kept him alive in places where careful attention to detail meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. Conservative estimates swirled in his head. Even if half these coins were common dates in average condition, he was looking at more money than he'd seen since his championship days. If any of them were rare dates or in exceptional condition, and they looked like they'd been carefully preserved, the total could be staggering. But the letters drew his attention away from calculations of wealth. The top envelope bore an address, Mr. Samuel Creek, General Delivery, Cedar Falls, Colorado Territory. The return address, in the same delicate handwriting, read, Miss Clara Mitchell, Cedar Falls School, a love letter then. But from when? Colorado Territory suggested the 1800s, before statehood. These letters could be more than a century old. Wes handled the envelope with the same care he'd give a butterfly's wing. The paper was fragile but intact, the ink faded but still readable. Should he open it? Did he have the right to read someone else's private correspondence? Scout solved his moral dilemma by lying down beside him with a contented sigh, as if to say the decision had already been made. Some secrets, the dog seemed to suggest, were meant to be discovered. The envelope opened easily, the old glue having long since given up its hold. Inside, 2 sheets of paper covered in that same careful handwriting. "My dearest Samuel," the letter began, and Wes found himself transported to another time, another world, where love letters were written by hand and promises were made with ink that was meant to last forever. As he read, a story began to unfold, a story of a schoolteacher and a prospector, of stolen moments and shared dreams, of plans for a future that included a cabin in the mountains where they would build a life together. This cabin. Wes looked around the dusty, neglected room with new eyes. This had been someone's dream home, their refuge, their promise of happiness. The rocking chair wasn't just furniture. It was where Clara had planned to sit in the evenings, perhaps reading, while Samuel worked at the table. The fireplace wasn't just for heat. It was where they would have sat together, planning their life, dreaming their dreams, and now he held their treasures in his hands. Their private words spread before him like a testament to love and hope, and all the things that could go wrong in a life. Scout stretched out beside him, placing his graying muzzle on his paws, and watched with patient amber eyes as Wes continued reading. The dog seemed to understand that they had stumbled onto something bigger than hidden treasure. They had found the remnants of lives lived and dreams deferred, of love that had transcended the grave to reach across the decades and touch two lonely souls who needed, more than anything, to believe that second chances were still possible. Outside, the wind continued to sing through the pines. But inside the cabin, by the light of a kerosene lantern, a broken cowboy and his faithful dog began to uncover a mystery that would change them both forever. Dawn crept through the gaps in the boarded windows, painting thin lines of gold across the cabin floor, where Wes still sat surrounded by the contents of the metal box. He'd been reading for hours, moving through Clara Mitchell's letters in chronological order, watching a love story unfold one carefully penned page at a time. Scout had awakened with the first light and now sat beside him, occasionally nudging Wes's elbow when the man became too absorbed in the correspondence. The dog seemed to understand the importance of what they'd discovered, maintaining a respectful quiet that was unusual for his typically energetic nature. The earliest letter was dated March 15th, 1887, and Clara's formal tone spoke of a relationship just beginning to bloom. "Dear Mr. Creek, I hope this letter finds you well and that your work in the mountains proves fruitful. I wanted to thank you again for your assistance with the schoolhouse roof. The children and I are most grateful for your kindness, but by the fifth letter, dated April 2nd, the formality had begun to melt away. My dear Samuel, I find myself thinking of our conversation by Miller's Creek more often than is proper for a school teacher. You spoke of the mountains with such passion, and I confess I would very much like to see them through your eyes." Wes found himself smiling despite the early hour and his exhaustion. He could imagine Clara Mitchell, probably in her 20s, teaching in a one-room schoolhouse, her days filled with children's laughter and lessons in arithmetic and reading. And Samuel Creek, weathered by mountain work, but gentle enough to fix a schoolhouse roof without being asked. The seventh letter, dated May 20th, marked a turning point. "Dearest Samuel, our walk yesterday has left me quite unsettled in the most wonderful way. When you took my hand to help me across the stream, I felt something I had not expected to feel in this remote place. I came to Cedar Falls to teach, to serve these mountain children, but I never imagined I might find someone, who could make me want to stay forever." Wes paused in his reading, struck by the parallels to his own story. He'd come to this cabin seeking solitude, an ending, but Scout's discovery had opened the possibility of something else entirely. The dog, as if sensing his thoughts, moved closer and rested his head against Wes's leg. The letters grew more intimate as spring turned to summer. Clara wrote of secret meetings, of walks in the high meadows, where Samuel showed her wildflowers she'd never seen in her native Ohio. She described his hands, gentle despite their calluses, careful despite their strength, and his eyes that hold depths like the mountain lakes you've shown me. But it was the letter dated August 14th that made Wes's chest tighten with recognition. "My beloved Samuel, you asked me last night if I could be happy in this wild country, away from the comforts and society I knew back east. Let me answer you with all the honesty my heart possesses. I am already happier here, in these mountains with you, than I have ever been anywhere else. When you speak of building a cabin where we might spend our winters, where you might write down all the stories of these hills you carry in your memory, I see not a rough shelter but a home filled with love and purpose. Yes, my darling, I will marry you. Yes, I will make my life here with you, in whatever home we can build together." Wes had to stop reading. The letter blurred before his eyes, and he realized he was thinking of Marie who had loved him before the drinking, before the failures, before he'd broken her heart with his weakness and his pride. She'd asked him once to build a life with her, to quit the rodeo and settle down, to choose love over the 8-second adrenaline rush that was slowly killing him. He'd chosen wrong. Scout whined softly and licked Wes's hand, pulling him back from the dark place where his memories lived. There were more letters to read, more of Clara and Samuel's story to uncover. The September letters spoke of wedding plans, of Samuel's success in the gold fields, of a future that seemed bright with promise. Clara had written to her sister in Ohio, describing her intended husband. "He's not like the men I knew back home, Samuel. He is quieter, more thoughtful, shaped by this landscape in ways that make him strong but never cruel. He has built a small fortune with his mining claims, enough for us to live comfortably, and he speaks of the cabin he is constructing for us with such love that I know it will be beautiful. The cabin." This cabin, where Wes now sat reading about its construction more than a century after the fact. Samuel Creek had built this place for Clara Mitchell, had hidden this treasure for her, had planned a life that included winter evenings by the fire and summer walks in the high meadows. But October brought the first note of worry to Clara's letters. "Dearest Samuel, it has been 2 weeks since I received a letter from you, and I confess I am beginning to worry. I know the mountain weather has turned harsh early this year, and I pray that is the only reason for your silence. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that there has been trouble with some of the mining claims, disputes over boundaries and accusations of claim jumping. Please write soon and tell me you are safe." The next letter, dated October 18th, carried deeper concern. "My darling, I have heard the most disturbing rumors from some of the miners who came through town. They speak of violence in the high country, of men disappearing, of claims being seized by force. I know you are careful, but I also know you have found something valuable up there, something that others might want to take from you. Please, Samuel, come back to town. Come back to me. Whatever gold you might find is not worth your life." The final letter in the bundle was dated November 1st, 1887, and Clara's handwriting showed the strain of fear. "Samuel, I'm writing this not knowing if you will ever read it, but I must try one more time to reach you. The first snow fell yesterday, and everyone says the high passes will be closed until spring. If you are trapped up there, if something has happened, I want you to know that I will wait. However long it takes, whatever has occurred, I will wait for you. The cabin we dreamed of building together is ready for us. I've seen it, though, from a distance, and it is beautiful. When spring comes, I will find a way to reach you, to bring you home. Until then, know that you carry my heart with you wherever you are." That was the last letter. Wes sat in the growing morning light, surrounded by the evidence of a love story that had ended before it truly began. Clara had waited through that winter, probably through the spring that followed, hoping for Samuel's return. But Samuel Creek had never come back to Cedar Falls, never claimed his bride, never lived in the cabin he'd built for their dreams. What had happened to him? The rumors Clara mentioned, violence, claim jumping, men disappearing, painted a picture of the dangerous reality of gold mining in 1887. Had Samuel been murdered for his claims? Had he simply walked away, unable to face the commitment he'd made? And what had become of Clara? Had she eventually given up and returned to Ohio? Had she found love with someone else? Or had she spent her life waiting for a man who would never come home? Scout stood and stretched, then moved to the cabin's front window, looking out at the mountains with an intensity that suggested he understood they were part of a larger mystery now. The dog's discovery had connected them not just to hidden treasure, but to unfinished business that had waited more than a century for resolution. Outside, the October morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Somewhere up there in those distant peaks lay the answers to Clara's questions, and perhaps the key to understanding what had really happened to Samuel Creek. Wes carefully returned the letters to their bundle, his hands gentle with the fragile paper. These weren't just historical artifacts, they were Clara's heart, preserved in ink and hope, waiting for someone to hear her story, and perhaps, finally, give her the answers she died seeking after a breakfast of coffee and canned peaches, the first hot meal Wes had managed to prepare on the cabin's ancient wood stove. He returned his attention to the metal box. Beneath Clara's letters, wrapped in another piece of oiled canvas, lay what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth by handling, and the leather had darkened with age. But the binding remained strong. Scout had taken up position by the front door, occasionally looking back at Wes with an expression that seemed to say, "Aren't you going to explore what's outside?" But Wes wasn't ready to leave the cabin yet. The journal in his hands felt heavy with secrets, and something told him he needed to understand Samuel Creek's story before venturing into the mountains where that story had ended. The first page was dated March 10th, 1887, just days before Clara's earliest letter, and Samuel's handwriting was precise, economical, the script of a man who measured his words carefully. Established camp at Willow Creek Junction. Water good, game abundant. First test panning shows color, not much but promising. We'll work upstream tomorrow. What followed was a meticulous record of Samuel's prospecting activities. Unlike Clara's emotional letters, these entries were pure business. Locations, dates, quantities of gold recovered, notes about promising formations and dead-end diggings. But as Wes read deeper, he began to see the man behind the measurements. April 15th. Found the schoolmarm reading to the children by Miller's Creek today. Miss Mitchell, she said her name was. Never seen anyone look so natural in wild country. When I offered to help with their roof, it's leaking something fierce, she smiled like I'd offered her the moon. Might be I'm getting soft in the head, but I find myself thinking about that smile while I'm working the sluice. Wes smiled despite himself. So Samuel had been just as smitten as Clara, though he expressed it in his matter-of-fact way. The journal continued to document both his growing feelings for the schoolteacher and his increasing success in the gold fields. May 22nd struck a rich pocket in the North Fork. Pulled 6 ounces in 2 days, more than I've seen since California. This country's got secrets it's ready to share with a patient man. Took Clara up to Devil's Backbone yesterday. She said the view was worth all the gold in Colorado. Might be she's right, but it was the entry dated June 3rd that made Wes sit up straighter. Found the big one today. The vein I've been tracking for weeks opens up into something that takes my breath away. Gold-bearing quartz thick as a man's arm, and it goes back into the mountain farther than I can follow with my lamp. This isn't pocket gold. This is the kind of strike that changes a man's life forever. Mark the location on my map. Need to file claims soon, but quietly. Word gets out about something like this, and I'll have every scoundrel in the territory breathing down my neck. Wes flipped through several pages, watching Samuel's excitement build and his caution increase in equal measure. By July, the prospector was pulling out substantial amounts of gold, but he'd also become increasingly worried about attracting the wrong kind of attention. July 18th. Burke and his associates have been asking questions in town. They know I'm doing well, too well for them to ignore. Burke claims to represent some investors from Denver, but I've heard stories about how he operates. Men who don't cooperate with his business arrangements tend to have accidents. Need to be more careful about my comings and goings. The name Burke appeared frequently in the later entries, always with a note of concern. Samuel described men following him, his camps being searched while he was away, and claims being filed suspiciously close to his own workings. August 20th. Someone's been at the North Fork site while I was in town. Didn't take anything, but they know where it is now. Clara and I made plans yesterday. We'll marry as soon as the cabin is finished, but I need to get my gold somewhere safe first. Can't trust the banks, not with Burke's connections. We'll bury the bulk of it where only I can find it again. Wes understood now why the metal box had been hidden so carefully. Samuel hadn't just been storing valuables. He'd been protecting them from men who would kill for far less than what lay before Wes now. The journal's tone grew increasingly urgent as autumn approached. September 15th, Burke made his move today. Offered to buy me out for a fraction of what my claims are worth. When I refused, he suggested I might want to reconsider for my health. Implied that pretty school teachers can have accidents too. That crossed a line. Nobody threatens Clara. Time to finish what I started and get out of these mountains before winter traps us all up here together. Scout had wandered back from the door and now lay beside Wes, seeming to sense the tension in the journal entries. The dog's presence was comforting as the story grew darker. October 2nd, moving the last of the big cash today. If something happens to me, I've left instructions for Clara hidden in the cabin. She'll know where to look. The main treasure is marked on the map I made for her. She's smart enough to figure it out, and careful enough to keep it secret until it's safe to claim. The final entries were brief, rushed, written in a hand that betrayed Samuel's growing fear. October 10th, they're watching me constantly now. Can't go to town, can't see Clara. If I don't make it out of this mess, I pray she understands why I couldn't come back to her. The cabin is ready, our home is waiting, but I won't bring this danger to her door. October 14th, Burke's men are camped between me and town. Only one way out now, through the high pass before the snows close it. Taking the small cash with me, leaving the rest for Clara if she needs it. If she doesn't, if she finds a better life than what I could give her, then let someone else find these riches and put them to good use. But if she waits for me, if she still wants the life we planned, then everything I've worked for is hers. The journal ended there, with Samuel Creek preparing to make a run for freedom that he'd apparently never completed. Wes closed the journal carefully, his mind racing with implications. Samuel hadn't abandoned Clara. He'd died trying to return to her, probably killed by Burke and his men somewhere in the high mountains. And Clara had waited, never knowing what had happened to the man she loved, never learning that he'd died trying to come back to her. The tragedy of it hit Wes like a physical blow. Here was a love story that had ended not in betrayal or lost interest, but in violence and greed. Two people who should have had a lifetime together, separated by men who cared more about gold than human happiness. But there was something else in Samuel's story that resonated with Wes on a personal level. The prospector had found his treasure, had made his fortune, but he'd also found something more valuable: love, purpose, a reason to build something lasting. And when faced with a choice between wealth and safety, Samuel had chosen to protect what mattered most. It was a choice Wes had never been brave enough to make. Scout stood and walked to the door again, scratching lightly at the wood. This time, Wes understood what the dog was trying to tell him. The cabin was just the beginning of Samuel and Clara's story. The real answers lay outside, in the mountains where Samuel had lived and worked and ultimately died. Wes looked around the cabin with new eyes, seeing not just neglect and decay, but the shell of someone's dream. Samuel had built this place for Clara, had crafted every log and stone with love and hope for their future. The least Wes could do was treat it with the respect it deserved. He spent the rest of the morning making basic repairs, tightening loose boards, cleaning the windows, sweeping out years of accumulated debris. As he worked, he found himself thinking about Samuel and Clara, imagining how the cabin might have looked when it was new, when it held the promise of happiness rather than the echo of loss. By afternoon, the cabin had begun to feel like a home rather than a shelter, and Wes Holt, for the first time in years, had begun to feel like a man with a purpose. The map that Samuel had drawn for Clara was a work of art, as much as navigation. Spread across the cabin's wooden table in the morning light, it revealed itself to be far more detailed than Wes had initially realized. Samuel had used different inks to show elevations, water sources, and vegetation, creating a three-dimensional picture of the high country that surrounded the cabin. Scout sat beside Wes as he studied the carefully drawn lines. The dog's attention focused on the map as if he too could read the secrets it contained. Occasionally, Scout would place a paw near one of the marked locations, and Wes found himself wondering if the border collie's instincts extended to understanding treasure maps. Willow Creek Junction, Wes murmured, tracing the route with his finger. Devil's Backbone Ridge, North Fork of Miller's Creek. The locations matched references in Samuel's journal, but seeing them laid out geographically gave Wes a clearer picture of the prospector's operations. Samuel had worked systematically, following the natural flow of the mountains, reading the land like a book that revealed its secrets to those patient enough to listen, but it was the symbols scattered across the map that intrigued Wes most. Small X marks indicated successful panning locations, while larger symbols some resembling crosses, others looking like stars, marked what Samuel had noted as significant finds near the largest of these symbols in the high country that lay beyond the visible peaks. Samuel had written in careful script, the big one, C will know, C for Clara. Samuel had expected his bride to follow this map, to claim the treasure he'd hidden for their future together. Wes looked up from the map to find Scout watching him with those intelligent amber eyes. "What do you think, boy? Feel like taking a walk in the mountains?" Scout's tail began wagging immediately, and he trotted to the door as if he'd been waiting all morning for the invitation. After packing a simple lunch and filling his water bottles, Wes folded Samuel's map carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of October day that made the Colorado high country look deceptively benign. But Wes knew better than to trust mountain weather. He'd learned that lesson during his brief stint in the Army, training in conditions that could kill the unprepared. The trail that led away from the cabin was barely visible after more than a century of neglect. But Scout seemed to sense where it should go, ranging ahead with the confidence of a dog who trusted his nose above all else. They followed what had once been a well-maintained path down into a valley where aspen trees blazed yellow against the dark green of spruce and fir. Willow Creek, when they reached it, was exactly as Samuel had described, clear water running over smooth stones, with beaver dams creating a series of small pools that would have been perfect for gold panning. Wes knelt beside the water and let it run through his fingers, imagining Samuel working this same spot more than 100 years ago, dreaming of the cabin he was building and the woman who would share it with him. Following the creek upstream, they began to climb into terrain that grew progressively wilder. The aspen gave way to pine, then to the hardy spruce that could survive at elevation. The air grew thinner, and Wes found himself breathing harder than he'd expected. Age and too many years of poor living had taken their toll on his lungs and heart, but Scout seemed tireless, bounding from rock to rock with the enthusiasm of a much younger dog. Occasionally, he would stop and look back at Wes with an expression that seemed to say, "Keep up, old man. We're getting close to something important." They found the first sign of Samuel's presence at what the map labeled as Good Color Creek, a tiny tributary that barely qualified as a stream. Half hidden under decades of fallen leaves and forest debris, Wes spotted the glint of rusted metal. Digging carefully, he uncovered what had once been a gold pan, its bottom worn smooth by countless hours of use. "Well, I'll be damned," Wes said, holding up the pan for Scout to see. Samuel worked this spot all right. The discovery energized him in a way he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just historical speculation anymore. This was proof that Samuel Creek had been exactly where his map said he'd be, doing exactly what his journal claimed he'd done. The treasure map wasn't fantasy. It was a real record of a real man's work. They continued upstream, and the signs of Samuel's presence became more frequent. A pile of stones that had once supported a sluice box, the remains of a lean-to shelter, its canvas long since rotted away, but the wooden frame still recognizable. Most telling of all, the scars in the hillside where Samuel had followed promising veins into the mountainside itself. The largest of these excavations was near a formation that matched Samuel's description of Devil's Backbone, a ridge of dark rock that jutted from the mountainside like the spine of some ancient beast. Here, Samuel had dug a shaft that descended into the mountain far enough that Wes couldn't see the bottom, even with his flashlight. Scout approached the shaft cautiously, his hackles rising slightly as he sniffed the air that rose from the depths. Whatever was down there, the dog didn't like it. "Easy, boy," Wes said, but he found himself sharing Scout's unease. The shaft was well constructed, with timber supports that had somehow survived more than a century of weather and neglect. Someone had put serious work into this excavation, the kind of effort that suggested they'd found something worth pursuing. But there was something else about the place that bothered Wes, something he couldn't quite identify. The forest around the shaft was too quiet, as if wildlife avoided this particular spot. The few trees that grew nearby had an unhealthy look to them, their needles brown and brittle despite the season. It wasn't until he was preparing to leave that Wes realized what had been nagging at him. Near the base of a large pine, partially hidden by undergrowth, lay what looked like scraps of fabric. Old fabric, faded and torn, but definitely not natural forest debris. Kneeling for a closer look, Wes felt his stomach tighten. The fabric was attached to something white, bone bleached clean by weather and time. And near the bones, glinting in the filtered sunlight, lay a tarnished metal object that made Wes's breath catch, a belt buckle. Ornate, well-made, the kind a successful prospector might wear to show his prosperity. Scout whined and pressed close to Wes's leg, sensing his master's distress. But Wes couldn't look away from the bones that lay scattered in the undergrowth. These weren't animal remains. They were human, and they'd been here for a very long time. Had they found Samuel Creek? The thought hit Wes like a physical blow. If these were Samuel's remains, then the prospector had never escaped the mountains, as he'd planned. He died here, at his most successful dig site, probably killed by the same men who'd been threatening him. But if Samuel was dead, buried in an unmarked grave beside his own mine shaft, then what had happened to the big one he'd written about in his journal? The main cache, the treasure he'd hidden for Clara. Looking at the map with new understanding, Wes realized that this location, impressive as Samuel's work had been, wasn't marked with the largest symbol. The big one was farther up the mountain, in terrain that would challenge even an experienced hiker. As they made their way back down the mountain in the growing afternoon shadows, Wes found himself thinking about dreams and the prices men paid to pursue them. Samuel Creek had found his fortune in these mountains, but it had cost him his life and his love. The gold was still here waiting, but the man who'd sacrificed everything to find it lay bones in the forest. His dreams as scattered as his remains, yet something about Samuel's story called to Wes in a way he couldn't ignore. Here was a man who'd worked hard, who'd found what he was looking for, who'd loved deeply and been loved in return. The fact that it had ended in tragedy didn't diminish the beauty of what Samuel and Clara had shared, or the significance of what Samuel had accomplished. For the first time in decades, Wes Holt found himself caring about something larger than his own disappointments. Samuel and Clara's story deserved to be finished. Their love deserved to be honored, and their treasure, well, maybe their treasure deserved to be found by someone who understood the cost of dreams and the value of second chances. Scout seemed to agree, trotting beside him with renewed purpose as they returned to the cabin that Samuel had built for Clara, the home that had been waiting more than a century for its story to reach a proper conclusion. That evening, as Wes sat by the cabin's restored fireplace, with Scout stretched out beside him, he found himself drawn back to Clara's letters. The discovery of what he believed to be Samuel's remains had cast the correspondence in a new light. These weren't just love letters anymore, but the final testament of a woman who'd loved a man she would never see again. He'd read through them once before, but now he approached them with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a tragedy. There had to be more to the story. Some clue about what happened to Clara after Samuel failed to return. It was while examining the ribbon that held the letters together, checking to see if it might contain any hidden messages, that Wes felt something, small and hard wrapped within the faded silk. Untying the ribbon carefully, he found a tiny bundle of tissue paper, yellowed with age and fragile as a butterfly's wing. Inside the tissue lay a ring. It was simple, elegant in its restraint, a thin band of gold with a small but perfectly cut diamond that caught the firelight and threw it back in brilliant flashes. The kind of ring a prospector might choose for his bride, valuable enough to show his love and success, but practical enough for a woman who would be building a life in the wilderness. Clara's engagement ring. The ring Samuel had given her. The ring she'd worn while planning their future together. The ring she'd hidden away when he failed to return. Wes held it up to the firelight, and the diamond cast tiny rainbows on the cabin walls. Such a small thing to represent such enormous dreams. But as he examined it more closely, he noticed something that made his chest tighten, scratched into the inside of the band. In letters so small they were barely visible were the words, "Forever yours." As Samuel had engraved the ring himself, probably working by lamplight with tools meant for mining rather than jewelry. The letters were uneven, rough around the edges, but they carried more love than any professional engraving ever could. But why was the ring here, wrapped in the letters, instead of on Clara's finger? Scout lifted his head and whined softly, sensing Wes's distress. The dog had developed an uncanny ability to read his master's moods, and the emotion radiating from the letters and ring was clearly affecting him too. "Easy, boy," Wes murmured, but his voice carried no conviction. Nothing about this discovery was easy. He searched through the letters again, looking for clues he might have missed the first time. The correspondence ended abruptly in November 1887, with Clara's promise to wait for Samuel's return. But there had to be more. What had happened during the winter that followed? Had she learned of Samuel's fate, or had she simply waited until hope became unbearable? It was Scout who provided the answer in his roundabout way. The dog had been sniffing around the cabin with renewed interest since their return from the mountains, and now he approached the fireplace mantel where the dusty photographs still sat in their frames. Scout stood on his hind legs, front paws against the mantel, whining and looking back at Wes expectantly. "What is it now?" Wes asked, but he was beginning to trust Scout's instincts completely. He lifted down the photographs and carried them to the table where the lamplight was stronger. Years of dust and grime had obscured the images, but careful cleaning with a damp cloth began to reveal the faces beneath. The first photograph showed a young woman in a white dress, her dark hair pinned up in the fashion of the 1880s. She had intelligent eyes and a gentle smile, and she was beautiful in the way that spoke of inner strength rather than mere physical perfection. Written in faded ink at the bottom of the photograph were the words, "Clara Mitchell, 1887. The second photograph showed the same woman, but older, perhaps in her 40s or 50s. The smile was sadder now, marked by years of waiting and disappointment, but her eyes still held the same intelligence and strength. This photograph was inscribed Clara Creek, 1904, Clara Creek. She'd taken Samuel's name even though they'd never married, had claimed his identity as surely as she'd kept his ring and his letters. She'd waited 17 years until she was no longer a young woman, still hoping that somehow Samuel would return to claim her. But the third photograph hit Wes like a physical blow. It showed Clara as an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, sitting in the very rocking chair that now occupied the cabin's main room. Her hair was white, her face lined with age, but she wore the same dress she'd been photographed in as a young woman, preserved perhaps for the wedding that never came. And on her left hand, visible even in the faded photograph, was the engagement ring that now lay on the table before Wes. The inscription on this final photograph read simply, "Clara Creek, 1924. She waited. Wes sank into the rocking chair, Clara's rocking chair, and felt something break loose inside his chest. Here was a love story more tragic than any Hollywood drama, more real than any fiction. Clara Mitchell had loved Samuel Creek so deeply that she'd spent her entire life waiting for him, had taken his name and kept his ring, and lived in the cabin he'd built for their dreams, never knowing that he was dead, never losing faith that someday he would return. She'd died waiting, the thought of it, of all those years spent looking toward the mountains, hoping to see Samuel's figure on the horizon, overwhelmed Wes in a way he hadn't expected. Tears that he'd been holding back for 20 years suddenly came in a flood that shook his entire body. He wept for Clara, who deserved better than a lifetime of loneliness. He wept for Samuel, who died trying to return to the woman he loved. But mostly he wept for himself, for Marie, who'd loved him the way Clara had loved Samuel, and for his own cowardice in letting her go. Marie had wanted to wait for him too. had begged him to quit the rodeo, to stop drinking, to build a life with her that had nothing to do with 8-second rides and arena crowds. She'd loved him enough to endure years of his failures and false promises, had taken care of him through injuries and binges and all the ways he'd found to sabotage his own happiness. But unlike Clara, Marie had finally given up. Unlike Samuel, Wes had survived to see the woman he loved walk away. He'd watched her pack her bags on that cold February morning, had stood silent as she begged him one last time to choose her over the bottle, over the rodeo, over whatever demons drove him to destroy everything good in his life. He'd chosen wrong, and she'd been wise enough to stop waiting. Scout climbed into his lap, all 60 pounds of border collies suddenly convinced he was a lapdog, and began licking, the tears from Wes's face with the patient dedication of a creature who understood grief and offered the only comfort he could provide. I let her go. Scout, Wes whispered into the dog's fur. I had what Samuel and Clara would have given anything for, and I threw it away like it was nothing. But even as he spoke the words, Wes felt something shifting inside him. Clara's tragedy wasn't just about loss. It was about love that endured, about faithfulness that transcended death, about the kind of devotion that could turn a simple cabin into a shrine to hope. She'd spent her life honoring Samuel's memory, preserving his dreams, keeping alive the possibility that love could conquer even the grave. Maybe it was too late for Wes to reclaim what he'd lost with Marie. Maybe some mistakes were too large, some words too cruel, some damage too complete to ever be repaired. But he could honor Clara's memory, could restore the cabin she'd preserved, could ensure that her story, their story, wasn't forgotten. Scout settled more comfortably in his lap, apparently satisfied that his human had reached some kind of understanding. Outside, the wind continued its eternal song through the pines, but inside the cabin, Wes felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: purpose. Tomorrow he would begin the real work of restoration. He would repair the sagging porch, replace the missing shingles, bring the garden back to life. He would make the cabin worthy of the love that had built it, worthy of the woman who'd spent her life preserving it, worthy of the dreams that had died in these mountains but somehow lived on in every board and stone. And maybe, if he worked hard enough and honored their memory completely enough, Clara and Samuel's story could teach him something about the difference between giving up and letting go, between losing hope and finding peace, between the treasure that glitters in the ground and the wealth that comes from finally understanding what really matters. The ring lay on the table before him, catching the firelight like a promise that had waited more than a century to be fulfilled. Not the promise of marriage, that hope had died with Samuel in the mountains, but the promise of love remembered, of devotion honored, of a story that deserved to be told, and a cabin that deserved to be home once more. 3 days into his restoration work, Wes discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about Samuel Creek's story. He'd been replacing the rotted floorboards near the fireplace when Scout began showing the same focused interest that had led to the discovery of the treasure box. This time, the dog's attention was fixed on a section of the stone foundation where the mortar had crumbled away, leaving gaps between the carefully laid rocks. "What now, boy?" Wes asked, but he was already kneeling beside Scout, running his fingers along the stones. One of them shifted at his touch, not loose but deliberately movable, balanced in a way that allowed it to be removed and replaced easily. The stone came away to reveal a cavity that had been carved into the foundation itself, lined with the same oiled canvas that had protected Samuel's other treasures. Inside lay a leather pouch, smaller than the metal box, but somehow more ominous in the way it sat heavily in Wes's hand. Scout whined and backed away from the pouch, his hackles rising. Whatever was inside, the dog wanted no part of it. Wes carried the pouch to the table and opened it by lamplight, his fingers finding objects that made no immediate sense. A tarnished metal star, some folded papers, and what felt like small metal cylinders. When he spread the contents on the table, the truth hit him like a hammer blow. The metal star was a sheriff's badge, ornate and official, inscribed with Cedar Falls, Colorado Territory, and bearing the six-pointed star that represented law and order in the frontier West. The metal cylinders were rifle cartridges, their brass cases green with age, but the lead bullets still intact. And the papers, when Wes unfolded them with trembling hands, contained a confession that rewritten everything he thought he knew about Samuel Creek's disappearance. The confession was in Samuel's handwriting, but the tone was completely different from his journal entries. Desperate, rushed, written by a man who knew he was about to die. If anyone finds this, know that Sheriff Tom Burke and his deputies murdered me for my gold claims. They've been running a claim-jumping operation for 2 years, forcing prospectors to sell out cheap or face accidents. When I refused their offer and threatened to report them to the territorial authorities, Burke said I'd signed my own death warrant. I've got proof of their crimes, names, dates, amounts stolen from innocent miners. Burke's been selling the information about successful claims to his associates, who then terrorized the prospectors until they abandoned their workings. At least 6 men have died refusing to cooperate, but the deaths were reported as mining accidents or bear attacks. Clara doesn't know any of this. I've kept it from her to protect her, but if something happens to me, she needs to understand why I couldn't come back. Burke threatened her directly, said pretty school teachers could have fatal accidents too if they asked too many questions about their missing fiancés. I'm writing this on October 15th, 1887. Burke and his men are camped between me and town, waiting for me to make a run for it. They don't know about this hiding place, and they don't know about the main cache. If I don't survive this, I pray Clara stays away from the mountains and never tries to follow my maps. The gold isn't worth dying for, but Burke will kill anyone who gets too close to the truth. The badge belongs to Deputy Marshal William Hayes, an honest lawman from Denver who was investigating Burke's operation. Hayes disappeared 3 months ago, and I found his body in a ravine near Devil's Backbone. Burke killed him to protect his operation, then had one of his associates appointed as the new deputy marshal. If Clara finds this confession, tell her I love her, and I'm sorry I couldn't build the life we dreamed of together. Tell her to take the small cash from the box and go back east, where she'll be safe. The main treasure isn't worth her life. Nothing is worth her life. God forgive me for what I've done and what I'm about to do. God protect Clara from the evil I've brought into her world. The confession was signed with Samuel's careful signature, but at the bottom, in different ink, was a final line that chilled Wes to the bone. Found this on the dead prospector. Might be useful someday. T. Burke, Sheriff. Burke had found Samuel's confession and kept it like a trophy, proof of his own power over the men whose lives he'd destroyed. But why hide it in the cabin's foundation? Unless... Wes's blood ran cold as the implication hit him. Burke hadn't just killed Samuel and taken his gold. The corrupt sheriff had moved into Samuel's cabin, had lived in the home Samuel built for Clara, had used it as his base of operations, while Clara waited in town for a man who would never return. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Burke had let Clara spend years wondering what happened to her fiancé, had let her waste her life waiting for a man he'd murdered, all while living in the very cabin that represented their hopes and dreams. But there was more. Wes found a second paper in the pouch, this one in Burke's handwriting, a list of names and dates that read like a catalogue of theft and murder. Jenkins, killed October 3rd, claims filed by Henderson Patterson, accident November 15th. Claims transferred to Morrison Creek, shot trying to escape October 16th. Cabin occupied Hayes, Marshall disposed of July 22nd. Investigation terminated Mitchell. Schoolmom disappeared December 1887. No witnesses. The last entry made Wes's heart stop. Clara Mitchell disappeared December 1887. Burke hadn't just murdered Samuel. He'd eventually killed Clara too, probably when she started asking too many questions about her missing fiancé. Scout began barking urgently, and Wes looked up to see headlights cutting through the darkness outside the cabin windows. A truck was coming up the mountain road, the first vehicle Wes had seen since arriving at the cabin days ago. Quickly, Wes shoved the confession and badge back into their leather pouch and returned it to its hiding place in the foundation. His military training kicked in. When you don't know if visitors are friendly, you prepare for the worst and hope for the best. The truck stopped outside, and Wes heard doors slamming, voices speaking in low tones. Through the window he could see at least 2 men approaching the cabin, flashlights in their hands, a knock on the door, firm, official, demanding. "Open up." "Sheriff's Department." Wes's mouth went dry. "Sheriff's Department." Like Burke all those years ago, using the badge of law enforcement to mask his crimes. "Just a minute," Wes called out, buying time to think. Were these legitimate officers, or was history repeating itself? Had someone learned about his discovery? Was the corruption that killed Samuel and Clara still alive in these mountains? Scout positioned himself between Wes and the door, his body tense and ready for whatever might come next. The dog's instincts had been right about everything else, and right now, those instincts were screaming danger. Another knock, harder this time. "This is Deputy Morrison." "Mr. Holt, we need to talk to you about some concerns raised by local residents." "Open the door, please, Morrison." Wes looked at Burke's list again, his blood running cold. Claims transferred to Morrison, the same name more than a century later. Either an incredible coincidence, or the corruption that had killed Samuel Creek had deep roots indeed. What kind of concerns? Wes called back, stalling while he tried to decide what to do. Reports of suspicious activity, strange lights at night. Folks in town are worried about someone camping up here without permission. "We just need to verify your right to be on this property." The response sounded reasonable, official, exactly what a legitimate deputy might say. But the name Morrison, combined with everything Wes had just learned about Burke's operation, made every instinct he possessed scream that something was wrong. Outside, he could hear the men moving around the cabin, their flashlights probing the windows. They weren't just waiting for him to open the door. They were surveying the property, looking for other ways in, behaving more like predators than protectors. Scout's growling grew deeper, more threatening. The dog had never reacted to strangers with such obvious hostility. "Mr. Holt, we're not going to ask again. Open this door, or we'll have to assume you're involved in illegal activity up here." The threat was barely veiled now, the thin pretense of law enforcement giving way to something much more dangerous. Wes realized he was facing the same choice Samuel Creek had confronted more than a century ago. Cooperate with corrupt men who wanted his treasure, or fight for his life in these lonely mountains where no one would hear him scream. But unlike Samuel, Wes had advantages. He knew what he was facing, understood the stakes, and had Scout beside him. A dog who'd proven his worth in more dangerous situations than this. More importantly, Wes was tired of running from fights. Tired of being afraid. Tired of making the wrong choices. Tired of letting good things slip through his fingers because he was too weak or too scared to hold on to them. Samuel Creek had died trying to protect the woman he loved and the treasure he'd worked so hard to find. Clara Mitchell had died because she'd refused to stop loving Samuel. Even when that love put her in danger, it was time for Wesley James Holt to find out what he was willing to fight for, and what kind of man he'd become when everything he'd learned about courage and cowardice was finally put to the test. The men outside didn't force their way in that night, but they didn't leave either. Through the cabin windows, Wes could see their cigarettes glowing in the darkness as they maintained a loose perimeter around the property. They were waiting, patient as hunters, confident that daylight would bring them what they wanted. Wes spent the sleepless hours studying Samuel's map by the dim light of a shielded lantern, finally understanding why the prospector had been so careful with his markings. The symbols that had seemed decorative were actually a code, designed to protect the treasure's location from exactly the kind of men who now surrounded the cabin. Scout lay pressed against Wes's leg, his body tense and alert, occasionally lifting his head to track sounds that human ears couldn't detect. The dog's stress was palpable, but so was his determination to stand guard over his master. As dawn approached, Wes made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Instead of surrendering to the men outside, instead of trying to negotiate or explain, he would do what Samuel Creek had been prevented from doing. He would claim the main treasure cache and use it not for personal gain, but to ensure that Samuel and Clara's story was finally told. But first, he had to crack Samuel's code. The key was in the prospector's journal, hidden in what had seemed like random observations about geology and weather. Samuel had been more clever than his straightforward manner suggested. The big one wasn't marked with an X or a star. It was indicated by a combination of natural landmarks that only someone who'd read his complete notes would understand. North face of the Sentinel, where the old bear trail crosses the creek that runs backwards when the moon is dark. Samuel had written the description like folklore, but Wes now recognized it as precise navigation instructions disguised as mystical nonsense. The Sentinel was clearly the tallest peak visible from the cabin, its north face marked on the map with a symbol that looked like a sleeping bear. The creek that runs backwards would be a stream whose flow reversed seasonally or with elevation changes, and when the moon is dark might refer not to lunar phases but to a shadowed canyon where moonlight never penetrated. It was brilliant, really. Samuel had created a treasure map that looked like a collection of legends and tall tales, meaningless to anyone who hadn't spent months learning the mountain's secrets. But to someone who understood his system, it was as precise as surveyor's measurements. The problem was reaching the location. According to the map, the main cache lay in terrain that would challenge an experienced mountaineer, accessible only through passes that were treacherous in good weather and deadly when storms moved in. And October in the high country meant weather could change from pleasant hiking conditions to life-threatening blizzards in a matter of hours. Wes had the skills for such a journey, though they were rusty from disuse. His 2 years in the army, before the rodeo career and long before the drinking began, had included mountain warfare training in conditions that made Colorado's peaks look hospitable. He'd learned to navigate by stars and terrain features, to survive on minimal supplies, to move through hostile territory without being detected. Those skills had saved his life more than once during his brief military service, but he'd never expected to need them again. Now facing men who represented the same corruption that had killed Samuel and Clara, Wes found himself grateful for training he'd tried to forget. The immediate challenge was getting away from the cabin without being caught. The men outside had positioned themselves to cover all the obvious exit routes, but they were thinking like law enforcement officers, or men pretending to be law enforcement officers. They expected their target to use doors and windows, to follow established trails, to behave like a civilian who respected authority even when that authority was corrupt. Wes had learned to think like a soldier. The cabin's foundation was built on a slope, creating a crawl space beneath the back wall that was invisible from outside, but large enough for a man and dog to squeeze through if they were determined enough. Samuel had probably used it as a root cellar, but it would serve as an escape route for someone who didn't mind getting dirty. By mid-morning, the men outside were growing impatient. Wes could hear them talking in low voices, their tone shifting from professional courtesy to something harder and more threatening. They wanted him to make the first move, to give them an excuse for whatever they planned to do. Instead, Wes spent the time preparing for a journey that might be his last. He packed light but carefully. Water, high-energy food, a first-aid kit, the folding knife that had already proven its worth, and Samuel's map protected in a waterproof pouch. Everything fit into a military-style backpack he'd bought years ago but never used. One of many purchases made during optimistic moments when he'd planned to get his life together. More importantly, he prepared mentally. The man who'd bought this cabin was a broken-down cowboy looking for a place to disappear. The man who would leave it was someone else entirely, someone who understood that some battles were worth fighting, some stories worth preserving, some loves worth honoring even when they belonged to strangers. Scout seemed to sense the change in his master's mood. The dog's anxiety shifted to anticipation, his body language suggesting he was ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. Border collies were working dogs, bred for intelligence and endurance, and Scout had been unemployed too long. The prospect of real work, real purpose, seemed to energize him despite the danger. "We're going to do something stupid, boy," Wes whispered as he checked his gear one final time. "We're going to go up into those mountains and find Samuel's treasure. And we're going to make sure Clara's story gets told the way it should be told." Scout's tail thumped once against the floor, a quiet acknowledgement that, stupid or not, they were in this together. The escape itself was almost anticlimactic. The crawl space beneath the cabin was larger than it appeared, wide enough for Wes to move through without too much difficulty, despite his age and Scout's size. They emerged 50 yards from the cabin, hidden by thick undergrowth and a depression in the terrain that Samuel had probably chosen specifically for concealment. From their hiding place, Wes could see 2 men positioned near the cabin's front entrance, smoking cigarettes and checking their watches with the impatience of people who weren't used to waiting. A third man was walking the perimeter, but his patrol pattern was lazy, unfocused, the behavior of someone who expected his quarry to come to him rather than the other way around. Moving through forests that had once been Samuel's domain, Wes felt a strange sense of connection to the long-dead prospector. Both of them were being hunted by corrupt men who used badges and authority to mask their greed. Both of them had found something worth protecting, and both of them were willing to risk everything to ensure that love and justice weren't completely defeated by violence and corruption. The difference was that Wes knew what he was facing, understood the true nature of the men who wanted Samuel's treasure. He also knew that Scout's instincts were as sharp as any early warning system the military had ever developed. And right now, those instincts were telling him they were being followed. The dog's behavior grew increasingly agitated as they climbed higher into the mountains, his attention constantly shifting to their back trail. Occasionally he would stop completely, ears pricked forward, listening to sounds that might have been wind through the pines, or might have been something more dangerous. They weren't alone in the mountains. By afternoon, they'd reached the location Wes believed corresponded to Samuel's Sentinel North Face reference. The terrain was exactly as brutal as the map suggested. Steep slopes covered with loose rock, narrow ledges that dropped away into canyons that seemed to have no bottom, and weather that shifted from clear skies to threatening clouds with alarming speed. This was country that could kill even experienced mountaineers. The kind of place where a single misstep meant a fall that would end only when the ravens found your bones. Samuel had chosen his final hiding place well. Anyone who wanted his treasure would have to risk their life to claim it. But as Wes studied the terrain more carefully, he began to see the genius in Samuel's choice. The location wasn't just defensible, it was a natural fortress, accessible by only one route, with clear sightlines in all directions. A man with a rifle and good cover could hold off a small army from this position. More importantly, the place had meaning beyond its tactical advantages. The view from the north face of the Sentinel encompassed the entire valley where Samuel had lived and worked and loved, including the cabin he'd built for Clara. A man could die here knowing he'd lived fully, loved completely, and left something beautiful behind. Scout had found a sheltered spot among the rocks and was now lying flat, his body language suggesting they should stay low and quiet. The dog's instincts had proven reliable so far, and Wes didn't question them now. From their concealed position, they could see movement on the trail below, 3 figures climbing steadily upward, following their route with the confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going. The corruption that had killed Samuel and Clara was still alive, still hunting, still willing to kill for gold that had cost too many lives already. But this time, the hunted man wasn't alone and unprepared. This time, he had advance warning, military training, and a partner whose loyalty transcended species. Most importantly, this time the stakes were clear. Not just personal survival, but justice for 2 people who'd loved each other across more than a century, who deserved better than unmarked graves and forgotten dreams. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the mountain landscape, Wes Holt made his final preparations for a confrontation that had been building since the moment Scout first scratched at those loose floorboards. The treasure was close now. He could feel it the way Samuel must have felt it, like a presence in the rocks and streams that spoke of dreams fulfilled and love preserved. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, Clara and Samuel's story would finally reach its proper conclusion. Even if it cost him everything he had left to give, the final approach to Samuel's cache required crossing a ledge so narrow that Wes had to press his back against the rock wall and shuffle sideways, one careful step at a time. Scout, with the sure-footed confidence of his border collie heritage, moved ahead with considerably more grace, occasionally looking back as if to encourage his slower human companion. Below them, the canyon dropped away into shadows so deep that the bottom was invisible, while above, the sentinel's north face rose like a wall of granite that seemed to touch the sky. This was the kind of place where men went to hide things forever, or to make their final stands against impossible odds. The ledge opened into a small cirque, a natural amphitheater carved from living rock by ancient glaciers. Protected from wind and weather by towering walls on three sides, it was the perfect hiding place, invisible from below, and accessible only to someone who knew exactly where to look. And there, at the base of the north wall, where shadows pooled even in daylight, Wes found what he'd been seeking and dreading in equal measure. Samuel Creek lay where he'd fallen more than a century ago, his bones scattered by time and weather but unmistakably human. The remains rested beside a pile of carefully stacked stones, as if Samuel had been building something when death found him. Nearby, partially buried under decades of fallen leaves and debris, the metal of his mining tools caught the afternoon light. Wes approached the grave, for that's what it clearly was, with the reverence due to a man who died for love and honor. Scout followed silently, his usual energy subdued by the solemnity of the moment. The skeleton was positioned in a way that suggested Samuel had been shot while working, probably from the concealment of the rocks above. A closer examination revealed the telltale hole in the skull that confirmed what Wes already knew. This hadn't been an accident or a peaceful death. Samuel Creek had been murdered while trying to complete his final task. Beside the bones lay the tool that defined Samuel's life and death, his mining pick. The wooden handle had long since rotted away, but the metal head remained, its edge still sharp, despite more than a century of exposure to the elements. This wasn't just equipment. It was Samuel's badge of office, the tool that had made his fortune and ultimately cost him his life. Wes lifted the pick reverently, feeling its weight and balance. Samuel had used this to carve wealth from the mountains, to build dreams from bedrock, to create the fortune that should have secured his future with Clara. Now it would serve as both memorial and weapon, a connection to the past and a tool for the justice that had been too long delayed. But it was what lay beyond Samuel's remains that took Wes's breath away. The pile of stones Samuel had been building wasn't random. It was a carefully constructed cairn, a marker pointing toward a cleft in the rock wall that was almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Inside that cleft, protected from weather and scavengers by Samuel's final act of defiance, lay leather sacks that contained more gold than Wes had ever imagined, not just coins, but raw gold in forms that spoke of a strike so rich it defied belief. Nuggets the size of walnuts, flakes so pure they caught light like trapped fire, dust so fine it seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. This wasn't the careful accumulation of a lifetime's work. This was the mother lode, the strike that turned prospectors into legends. Samuel had found it, claimed it, and died protecting it from men who would have killed him regardless of whether he cooperated. The treasure that should have bought him a lifetime of happiness with Clara had instead bought him a bullet and an unmarked grave in the mountains he'd loved. But even in death, Samuel's planning had been meticulous. Hidden among the gold, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected it from moisture and decay, was a final letter addressed to Clara. The handwriting was shaky, written by a man who knew death was approaching, but the words were clear. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then I have failed to return to you as promised. But I have not failed to provide for your future. The gold in this place is yours by right of love, claimed fairly and hidden safely until you could reach it. Use it to build the life we dreamed of, even if you must build it without me. Know that my last thoughts were of you, of the cabin that waits for us both, of the love that death itself cannot diminish." Wes had to stop reading, his vision blurred by tears that seemed to come from some deep well of grief he hadn't known existed. This was what love looked like when it was tested by impossible circumstances. Not perfect, not without cost, but enduring enough to reach across more than a century and touch a broken cowboy who'd thought he'd forgotten what devotion meant. Scout's sharp bark shattered the moment's reverence, and Wes spun toward the sound with Samuel's pick in his hands. The dog was positioned at the entrance to the cirque, his body tense with aggression. His attention focused on the narrow ledge they'd used to reach this place. The claim jumpers had found them. 3 men appeared on the ledge, moving with the confidence of people who'd made this climb before, who knew these mountains better than any tourist or casual treasure hunter should. The leader was a large man, with the soft bulk of someone who'd grown prosperous on other people's work, while his companions had the lean, dangerous look of men who were comfortable with violence. Well, the large man called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Looks like we found ourselves a regular treasure hunt up here." Wes recognized the voice immediately. It was the same man who'd identified himself as Deputy Morrison the night before, though he wore no badge now and carried himself with the arrogance of someone who'd never answered to any authority but greed. "You can put down that old mining pick, Mr. Holt," Morrison continued, his tone conversational but his eyes fixed on the leather sacks that contained Samuel's gold. "We're not here to hurt anybody. We're just here to collect what's ours by right of, let's call it inheritance." The casual admission that they were descendants of the original claim jumpers sent a chill down Wes's spine. The corruption that had killed Samuel and Clara had literally been passed down through generations, a family business built on murder and theft. But as Morrison and his men began moving into the cirque, spreading out to cut off any escape route, Wes felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: the cold, focused clarity that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant death. He wasn't the broken cowboy who'd bought a $5 cabin anymore. He wasn't the man who'd let love slip through his fingers because he was too weak to fight for it. He was Wesley James Holt, and he was standing in a place where good men had died for love and honor, holding a tool that represented everything worth fighting for. Scout moved to his side, and Wes could feel the dog's readiness, his willingness to stand and fight regardless of the odds. Together, they represented the only justice Samuel and Clara would ever receive, the only chance their story had of reaching a proper conclusion. The mining pick felt solid and purposeful in Wes's hands as he prepared to finish what Samuel Creek had started more than a century. Ego Morrison's overconfidence proved to be his undoing. The man clearly expected Wes to surrender without a fight, to recognize the futility of resistance against 3 armed men in an isolated mountain cirque. What he didn't expect was to face someone who'd been trained to turn desperate situations into tactical advantages. Someone who'd learned that the willingness to die for something made you far more dangerous than men who only fought for money. "Last chance." "Old man," Morrison called out as his companions moved to flank Wes's position. "Hand over what you found and we'll make this easy for you." Wes didn't respond. Instead, he pulled Clara's photograph from his jacket pocket, the one showing her as a young woman, beautiful and full of hope, and pressed it gently against Samuel's scattered bones. "I'm sorry I can't bring her to you," he whispered to the long-dead prospector. "But I can make sure your story gets told right." Scout understood before the humans did what was about to happen. The border collie's bark wasn't a warning, it was a war cry. the sound of a working dog who'd found his purpose at last. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, but Wes had chosen his position well. With his back to the rock wall and Samuel's cache protecting his flank, he could face his enemies one at a time rather than being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Morrison's first mistake was assuming that age and alcohol had destroyed Wes's reflexes. His second was underestimating Scout. The dog hit Morrison's closest companion low and hard. 60 pounds of muscle and determination focused on the man's gun hand. The claim jumper's scream echoed off the stone walls as Scout's teeth found their target, sending his weapon spinning across the rocky ground. Wes used the distraction to close distance with Samuel's mining pick, the tool's weight and balance feeling natural in his hands. His rodeo years had taught him to move with controlled violence in confined spaces, to use momentum and leverage rather than raw strength. His military training had taught him to end fights quickly. Before opponents could recover from their initial surprise, the pick's metal head connected with Morrison's weapon as the larger man tried to bring it to bear, the impact numbing both their hands but sending the gun clattering out of reach. Morrison followed up with a vicious swing aimed at Wes's head, but years of dodging bullhorns and flying hooves had given Wes reflexes that didn't fade with age. He ducked under Morrison's punch and brought the pick, handle up in a strike that would have shattered the man's jaw if he'd connected fully. Instead, Morrison stumbled backward, blood streaming from his split lip, his eyes showing the first hint of uncertainty. The third attacker had circled wide, trying to retrieve his companion's dropped weapon, while Scout and the second man thrashed across the rocky ground. But Scout had been bred for intelligence as well as courage, and border collies were notorious for their ability to track multiple threats simultaneously. The dog released his original target just as the third man's fingers closed around the gun grip, launching himself across the intervening space with timing that would have made a professional athlete proud. The impact sent both dog and gunman tumbling toward the edge of the cirque, their struggle bringing them dangerously close to the canyon's rim. Wes couldn't help Scout. Morrison had recovered from the initial exchange and was pressing his attack with the desperate strength of a man who realized his easy victory had become a fight for survival. But the larger man's bulk, which should have been an advantage in close quarters, made him slow and predictable. Wes let Morrison charge him, then used the prospector's own momentum against him, stepping aside and using the pick handle to guide his opponent toward the rock wall. The impact stunned Morrison long enough for Wes to get behind him, the pick's handle across the man's throat in a chokehold that cut off both air and blood flow. "This is for Samuel," Wes whispered as Morrison's struggles weakened. "And Clara and everyone else your family destroyed for their gold." Morrison collapsed, unconscious but breathing. Wes might have been willing to kill in self-defense, but he wasn't a murderer. Justice could be served without becoming the kind of man he was fighting against. Scout had solved the problem of the third attacker in his own way by driving the man back against the cirque's edge until he lost his footing and tumbled into a crevice deep enough to trap him, but not deep enough to kill him. The dog's second opponent had given up the fight when he realized his gun was gone and his partners were defeated, choosing surrender over the uncertain mercy of an angry border collie. In the sudden quiet that followed violence, Wes found himself standing over Samuel's bones, with Clara's photograph still clutched in his hand. The treasure remained where Samuel had hidden it, more gold than most men saw in a lifetime. Enough wealth to transform a broken cowboy into a rich man. But as Wes looked at the photograph, at Clara's young face full of hope and love, he made a choice that Samuel would have understood perfectly. The gold had cost too much already. Samuel's life, Clara's happiness, the innocence of a generation that had believed law badges meant justice rather than corruption. No amount of wealth could compensate for that loss, and keeping it would make Wes complicit in the crimes that had created it. Instead, he began the work that Samuel had died trying to complete, gathering the scattered bones with respectful care, arranging them properly, placing Clara's photograph where Samuel could hold it for eternity. The prospector had waited more than a century to be reunited with his bride's image. It was time they were together at last. Scout watched this ritual with the patient attention he'd shown throughout their adventure, occasionally approaching to sniff at something that interested him, but never interfering with the solemnity of the moment. The dog seemed to understand that some things were more important than treasure, that honor and love were worth more than gold. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the cirque in shades of gold and shadow, Wes completed his work. Samuel Creek finally rested with dignity, his bones properly arranged. Clara's photograph placed where the mountain winds couldn't disturb it, the mining pick that had been both tool and weapon lying beside him, like a faithful servant. The treasure would remain where Samuel had hidden it, protected by the same mountain fortress that had sheltered his final moments. Someday, perhaps, someone would find it who deserved its wealth more than the men who'd killed for it. But for now it would wait, as Clara had waited, as love itself waits for justice to find its way home. In the gathering darkness, Wes Holt and Scout began their descent from the mountains, carrying with them not gold, but something far more valuable, the knowledge that some stories end with honor, that some loves transcend death, and that sometimes the greatest treasure a man can find is the courage to do what's right, regardless of the cost. 6 months later, the cabin that Samuel Creek had built for Clara Mitchell had become what they'd always intended it to be, a home filled with love and purpose, a place where stories were told and memories were honored. Wes stood on the restored front porch, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed in the crisp April morning air. The sagging boards had been replaced with timber that matched Samuel's original work, and the roof no longer leaked when mountain storms rolled through the valley. Every repair had been made with the same care Samuel would have used, every detail chosen to honor the dreams that had built this place. Scout lay stretched out in a patch of sunlight, his graying muzzle resting on his paws as he watched the road that led up from town. The dog was older now, moving a little slower than he had during their adventure in the mountains. But his amber eyes still held the intelligence and loyalty that had saved both their lives that day in the cirque. The legal documents that established Wes as the cabin's rightful owner lay framed on the mantelpiece inside, next to the photographs of Clara that told the story of a woman who'd loved beyond reason and waited beyond hope. But more important than legal ownership was the moral authority that came from understanding what this place meant, why it mattered, and how its story deserved to be preserved. The Samuel Creek and Clara Mitchell Historical Foundation had been Wes's way of ensuring that their love story would outlast the mountains themselves. Funded by a portion of the gold that Wes had eventually returned to claim, but only after Morrison and his companions had been prosecuted for attempted murder and a century of family crimes. The foundation maintained the cabin as a memorial and educational center. Visitors came regularly now, drawn by the story of the prospector and schoolteacher whose love had transcended death. Children from the local school took field trips to learn about Colorado's mining history. Couples planning weddings asked to see the cabin where true love had been tested and proven eternal. Historians came to study the documents and artifacts that Wes had donated to the foundation's collection. But it wasn't the visitors that had transformed Wes's life. It was the work itself, the daily practice of caring for something larger than his own disappointments, of preserving a love that had lasted more than a century. The sound of a car engine climbing the mountain road made Scout lift his head, his tail beginning a tentative wag. Wes smiled, recognizing the cautious optimism in the dog's body language. After 6 months, Scout still couldn't quite believe their good fortune was permanent. Still waited each morning for the other shoe to drop. The car that came around the final bend was familiar. Now a sensible sedan, driven by a woman who'd learned to navigate mountain roads with the same careful attention she brought to everything else in her life. Marie pulled to a stop in the spot that had become hers by right of return, by the slow rebuilding of trust that had begun with a letter and continued with weekly visits that had gradually become something more. She stepped out of the car with the easy grace of a woman who'd found her way back to something she'd thought lost forever. Her auburn hair, now streaked with silver, caught the morning light as she approached the porch where Wes waited with the patient stillness of a man who'd learned the difference between waiting for something and working toward it. "Morning, Cowboy," she said, her voice carrying the warmth that had made him fall in love with her 30 years ago and the strength that had kept her going through all the years he'd let her down. "Morning. Beautiful," he replied, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. Scout's tail accelerated to full happiness as Marie climbed the porch steps, and she paused to scratch behind his ears in the way that had made her the dog's second favorite person in the world. The border collie had accepted her return with the pragmatic wisdom of an animal who understood that some things were worth waiting for, even when the waiting lasted decades. Marie settled into the rocking chair that had once been Clara's, accepting the cup of coffee Wes had prepared for her with the ritual comfort of a routine that had become precious to both of them. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb over the peaks that surrounded the valley, listening to the wind sing through the pines that had witnessed so many love stories begin, end, and sometimes, against all odds, begin again. "Mrs. Henderson is bringing her granddaughter up this afternoon," Marie said eventually. "She wants to hear the story of Samuel and Clara before she heads back to college." Wes nodded, pleased. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing with each telling, becoming part of the valley's folklore in a way that honored both the historical truth and the deeper meaning of love that endures beyond death. "What will you tell her?" Marie asked. Wes considered the question, looking out at the mountains where Samuel had died and been reborn as legend, where Clara had waited and been transformed into a symbol of faithfulness that inspired couples more than a century later. "I'll tell her that some treasures can't be measured in gold," he said finally. "That the real wealth in this world comes from loving someone enough to honor their memory, from being loyal enough to wait for what matters, from being brave enough to fight for what you believe in, even when the odds are impossible." Marie's hand found his across the space between their chairs, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that spoke of forgiveness earned and trust rebuilt. "And I'll tell her," Wes continued, his voice thick with emotion, "that sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. And the only way to honor that gift is to love better than you did the first time." Scout lifted his head and looked at them both with the satisfied expression of a dog whose humans had finally figured out what he'd known all along, that home wasn't a place you bought for $5 or inherited through accident, but something you built with patience and care, and the willingness to believe that love could overcome any obstacle, even death itself. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and patient, keeping their secrets and stories, waiting for the next broken soul who would find healing in their shadows and strength in their silence. And in the cabin that Samuel built for Clara, where Wes had found his redemption and Marie had found her way back to love, the greatest treasure of all continued to grow, the knowledge that some endings are really beginnings, and some discoveries are worth waiting a lifetime to make. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the restored cabin in shades of gold and promise, while inside, the frame deed that made Wes Holt the legal owner of 5 acres and a dream served as proof that sometimes the best investments are the ones made with the heart rather than the head, and that the richest men are those who understand the true value of home.